Hi, everyone. So this is a presentation that was given in February 2025 at the integration workshop for the John H. Templeton Foundation grant on humility and inquiry. It was sort of the predecessor to the Society for Personality and Social Psychology conference. And this project was focused on developing a text-based measure of humility and inquiry, HI, and examining the contextual effects. And so part of our project team includes myself and Dr. Sarah Bratt. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Information at the University of Arizona. And co-presenting with me at the Denver Integration Workshop was Dr. Charles Lassiter, associate professor at Gonzaga University. And as well, we were part of a multidisciplinary team on this grant, including Dr. Jina Lee, an assistant professor at School of Sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, as well as at the University of Arizona, we have Dr. Erin Leahey at the School of Sociology, our doctoral student on the grant, Yeaeun Kwon, and Dr. Charlie Gomez, an associate professor at the School of Sociology. And then at Ithaca College, we have our other philosopher on the project, in addition to Charlie, Dr. Brendan Murday. And so this project was really inspired and sort of generated from the previous research on everyday inquiry by laypersons. And some of these studies initial studies are using machine learning on self-reports data, such as diary entries, people entering in some of their thoughts and beliefs into their diaries, and running machine learning models on those to identify intellectual humility, and as well as self-report survey data. Now, our research shifts from this context to systematic inquiry by scientists, specifically looking at this ready-made formal science, as Bruno Latour put it, as opposed to science in the making. And here we're looking at the full text of journal articles to capture humility and inquiry. Now, why science? Why science is our context? Well, it turns out that science is a rich site to examine humility in inquiry, partially because of some of the tensions that underlie scientific norms. Some of the Mertonian norms, Thomas Merton's norms of science, include these kind of tensions around passion and detached objectivity. Scientists are thought to be passionate, but also to perform this detached objectivity. As well, standing on the shoulders of giants, there's this sort of conservative tradition. As well, they're expected to perform sort of disruptive innovation or identify novel solutions. And finally, there's this tension between, science as it valorizes organized skepticism towards one's work and one's own, while also holding all these other values at the same time. So we focus on full text as our data, and we find that textual data is quite ideal, actually, because they can capture the nuance and thus variations and types of HI. And as I mentioned previously, Abedin et al. Were the first to use the text in the diary entries to study intellectual humility. And here we are actually going to be using the full text of scientific articles to study this bit of a different concept of humility in inquiry. So this is an emerging field right now. But one reason why we're looking at the formal text of scientific communication is because it's kind of a shift of linguistic norms. So we have to be careful about the kinds of characterizations of humility that we perform. So linguistic norms differ between different types of text. For example, in diary entries, there's informal language, and you're kind of ruminating on sorts of things that are occurring throughout your day-to-day life. It prizes subjectivity. It's not constrained by the institutional norms of science, and it's typically for private purposes. Compare that with scientific articles. You have formal language that prizes persuasion, and it might minimize uncertainty cues. It prizes objectivity, minimizing emotional cues in the use of third person, and it has some requirements around format of syntax, might require a limitation section, and it's really intended for public use. So given our full text as our data, we proceeded with data collection. We, again, used the full text of scientific articles from a common resource, more and more common, I should say, in the science of science, that is OpenAlex and Semantic Scholar Academic Graph, pronounced STAG, if you were interested. And so our sample of full text include English language peer-reviewed articles, as well as empirical articles. That is, we filtered out errata, editorials and reviews, and we have a targeted time sample, more recent, just the last decade from 2014 to 2024. so we have now, yay, completed our first phase, which is measuring AI. And now we're taking the classifiers that we developed in our second phase to examine the correlates of humility and inquiry. So during phase one, we developed a couple of classifiers so that we could identify humility and inquiry in scientific text. We used natural language processing to develop and are currently continuing to refine some of those classifiers that identify humility in the full text of published scientific articles. So the way we did this, if you're not familiar, anyone out there familiar with machine learning, natural language processing? Yeah, so this is an area that continues to develop and continues to be multidisciplinary. And specifically what the machine learning procedure usually begins with is to label your data for training. So for us, this was an intensive process. Humility and inquiry is a new concept that doesn't have a deductive framework. So we had to inductively identify instances of humility in scientific articles. With our multidisciplinary team, whom you were introduced to in the beginning of these slides, we inductively labeled 1,027 sentences from 29 journal articles across 19 disciplines. And how we did this was we started out with at least 2 individuals, and they coded every sentence for humility or not humility, and then some subtypes, which we'll get into in a moment. And from there, our 6-person team came to consensus through an iterative process until all of our sentences were identified as having humility. So as you can see in my animation here, we have sentence 1 is humility, sentence 2 is anti-humility, and sentence 3 is H for humility, and sentence 4 is H- for anti-humility. And so we identified the sentence as expressing humility, not humility, anti-humility, or none. And so through this process, we actually got pretty granular in our codebook. So the next step was to develop a codebook. We identified inductively 4 types of humility and 3 types of what we're calling anti-humility or arrogance. And the 4 types of humility are F, T, I, and A. F is when you express fallibility. You express that you could be limited. You engage in some robustness checks. T, using tentative or tempering languages. You might see some hedges or uncertainty cues. I, noting that the work is incomplete and that future elaboration might be needed. And A, acknowledging alternative views or perspectives. And then we come to our subtypes for anti-humility or colloquially arrogance, which is F-, written in firm terms, T-, written in certain terms, and C, claiming novelty or promoting your own work. And so some examples of these during the codebook development include, here's one of F, which as you'll remember is fallibility, admitting that you might be wrong. We see this sentence: one could worry that our confidence elicitation is complicated or noisy, or otherwise does not capture evaluators' true expectations about gender differences in confidence. So here we do see some expression of the limitations of the study. As well for F-, here's an example sentence that was F-. In the study, we demonstrate that the absence of gut microbiota induces depression-like behavior in mice, and that the composition of gut microbiota is significantly altered in MDD patients. And so these 2 sentences are just examples of our labeled data. So the next step was to use or try some large language models. So we actually tried several large language models, including Cybert, including Aspire, but we found that actually DiBerta worked really well. So we fine-tuned DiBerta to develop a classifier, actually 3 classifiers, by giving it our HI labeled data. Now, DiBerta is a relatively new large language model. It was developed by Microsoft in 2020. And it was pre-trained on a large corpus of text, actually English Wikipedia and public Reddit content. So it performs well on ambiguous words or phrases. This is kind of interesting because if you think about it, we are using scientific articles, not public Reddit content. So it's interesting that this particular LLM worked really well. But as you know, it is pre-trained. So of course it can do things like identify ambiguous words, distinguish between like, I feel fine today, she has fine blonde hair. And so from here, we fed these sentences into our pre-trained LLM, and it gave us a classification outcome with some F1 scores. So if you're not familiar with this process, I'm going to break it down for you. So what do we do when we are running our classifier? Well, here's our beautiful labeled data of our sentences with H, our sentences with H-. This is kind of shorthand. We actually labeled sentences with, A, I, T, those subtypes that you saw, but this is just shorthand to show you an example. And then we split it into training data, that's the sentences with the labels, and then test data where we masked the labels so that the classifier couldn't see it. And they wanted to, we made it guess. Can Roberta guess the right label based on the training sentences? And then we get our confusion matrix to tell us how well the classifier did on those masked sentences. We get our true positives, our false positives, our false negatives, our true negatives, and ultimately our F1 score. And the F1 score is really important because it tells us which classifier that we should choose, right? So we selected the best classifier for humility inquiry using that F1 score. So here, the shorthand, basically all you need to know from the slide is that we have 3 classifiers that perform pretty well. As you can see, the F1 score, for example, for our first classifier, which was a binary or 2-label classification, includes humility and none, including arrogance or H-. And the classifier guesses the HI labels correctly 90% of the time. Pretty good. Now, our second classifier is a 3-label classification. We get more information. We get humility, not humility, and neither humility or anti-humility in that sentence. And the classifier gets the sentence label right about 85% of the time. And finally, our 5-label classification, which is pretty interesting because it gives us this granular alternative views, expressing fallibility, incompleteness, tempering, and none. The classifier identifies, about 3 out of 4 sentences correctly. So even though this looks like a streamlined process, of course, this is a science ready-made. And so we did face some challenges in labeling. And one that we just wanted to highlight is statistical language can sometimes look like humility, right? For example, women are less likely to believe they answered 3, 5, or 7 questions right. They are less likely to believe this. And so it sounds like you're hesitating or being tentative or hedging. And so that could be a red herring for humility. So we had to take, we had a label for tentative language, which we called T-stat, and then we removed those sentences from the training, we added those sentences to the training with the label that said, it looks like humility, but it's actually statistical language. And then also there's a lot of ambiguity, right? We actually had a lot of sentences with multiple labels because there's multiple things going on. There's like confidence, but also hedging, but also you're stating your gap, but you're also saying I'm the best in the world. So we had to have multiple labels for some of these sentences and just at the phrase level. For example, only an intervention that facilitates Bayesian updating proves effective. Seems pretty confident, right? Like that might be an F- because it's so confident. But then we have this hedging term, somewhat. So that indicates to us that there is a little bit of hesitation. So that might be F, right? Fallibility or tempering, T. So when we had these, we either removed the multi-labels from our training or we decided upon their overall rhetorical force and went with that for our overall label. So now we are in phase 2, in which we're examining the correlates of HI. Now we're doing this by looking at 3 guiding questions that are of interest to various members on the team, given their expertise and background. For example, I'm pursuing the first question, which is, does open science foster humility in inquiry? And what we expect right now is that works published on arXiv will display less HI than their published versions. And we're also looking at some data sharing policies around this question to see if journals that have data sharing policies and requirements encourage more HI of certain kinds. And second, is HI gendered? So we expect that works by women researchers to express more humility than male men researchers or other gender identities. And third, does humility vary across national cultures? So here we might expect work by scholars from nations with collectivist cultures to exhibit greater HI than works by scholars from more individualist cultures. And so these research questions really hinge on a philosophical assumption. So they assume that context is significant, gender, collectivist culture, if you're participating in open science, that those might influence HI expressions. So what can that mean philosophically for thinking about subjects of humility? And I should just say our wonderful philosopher, Charlie Lassiter, usually presents this section. So just bear with me as I try to be a philosopher right now. So there are metaphysical and epistemic implications, questions about being and questions about knowledge when we start to ask questions about humility in scientific inquiry and things that might influence that. So traditionally, we think about a person having humble characteristics. I am a humble person. I have humility. That is my character. I was born with it. You think about that kind of virtue. But in this project, we're shifting to individuating subjects of humility using a framework of distributed cognition, which is actually something that is a theory that's also used in science and technology studies as well. So there is some overlap. I'm not completely out of my depth here. So the idea then is it's not just you, the individual person, but a system, and that can influence your behaviors and actions as well as your own agency within this distributed system. So distributed cognition is the idea that cognitive systems, thinking systems, are composed of multiple pieces. It's me, but it's also me in an environment. Those heterogeneous parts that work together to accomplish a task. So, for example, Herbert Simon had this example of an ant who, is living his best life, and the ant goes out and it gets some food, and then it drops some pheromones, on the way when it finds the food source, and then the other ants use those pheromones to find the food source as well. So it's not just the ant and its internal parts that enabled them to find the food, and the other ants as well. It's this multiple pieces. It's the pheromones, it's the ants, it's the communication with the other ants, etc. And if you just looked at the ants' internal states, you wouldn't get the full picture, right? As well, you might have heard of Hutchins' work on naval vessels coming into port. Hutchins found that it is multiple sailors all doing tasks in distributed areas of the ship that enables the ship to be docked. It's not one centralized brain per se. It's all these tiny movements and activities that come together to accomplish the task. And so in this project, we similarly were focused on systems behaviors in the analysis to identify the parts of the system that are relevant for the expressions of humility. And so philosophers call this individuation. That's just like picking out what are the relevant pieces of a system. And so if you're narrowly individuated, then you are you, that person. If you're widely individuated, it's you, it's me, it's my microphone, it's my, my family history, it's, the technologies I have at my disposal, how fast is my internet speed. And so here we want wide individuation when we're thinking about humility. Widely individuating agents is when you consider the role of the agent in a wider system, you're carving nature at its joints differently. Classification people in NLIS will appreciate that, library science. So this is analogous to the analysis of a whole network or one node in the network. And so Nathan Valentine, who is one of the leaders of this movement around humility and inquiry, and one of the leaders of the project that we're working on here for Templeton Foundation, wrote this essay that indicated, we might start thinking about scripts that encourage humility or constrain humility. And so in the context of science, one thing that he mentions in this essay is that you might want to inquire in the way that an idealized opponent would want you to inquire. And so he brings up this example of peer review systems. So it's not, that an individual within the peer review system is being humble. It's that peer review encourages more of a humble attitude because your reviewers of your paper might say, hey, have you considered this limitation? Have you considered this other paper? And so in that way, even if you're a grumpy scholar who doesn't want to respond to a review or two, and is really not, interested in the limitations that the other reviewers are mentioning, it's the whole system and your participation in it that's achieving humility and inquiry because you're participating in it rather than you having like a character trait of humility. So since our view of this distributed cognition enables focus on just a part of the system, humility is predictable of widely individuated activities as well. So all this theory, how are we pulling that into sort of a coherent whole? Well, our first pass of this is going to be to create a 5-tuple of different parts. So instead of just focusing on the individual, we're going to focus on the wider context, including people, places, time, tools, and the topic. So for example, for national culture, for gender, and open science, those are situational elements of a distributed cognitive system. Science or a field, and are prima facie causally relevant for inquiry processes. So that's why we look at these research questions, right, in context, and we think of them as distributed systems of inquiry that might encourage or discourage humility. So given our progress here, both on the empirical side and the philosophical side, we have a few publications both in progress and also already submitted and published. And the first was at the Association for Information Science and Technology that was presented at the annual meeting last November in Calgary, Canada. And that focused on developing a text-based measure of humility and inquiry using computational grounded theory. Happy to share that paper. And then we'll be presenting at the Society for the Social Studies of Science next September in Seattle, Washington, on epistemic humility and distributed inquiry systems with the whole team. We're also working on a methodology paper, open science effects on HI for the International Conference of Science and Innovation, and a distributed inquiry systems paper. So with that, thank you so much for listening, and definitely reach out if you have any questions.